talking about. We're going to add one more piece to the conversation here and talk about equity in transportation electrification. It's a really core value of what we believe in at Electrification Coalition. We have in the past had a variety of speakers on this topic, including from the Greenlining Institute, which is a leader in this space. And they weren't able to be here today with us. But fear not, we have our own resident expert on these topics, Neda Deylami. She's a field organizer with Electrification Coalition and an EV advocate for many years. So I'm going to turn things over to Neda and have her help share with us ideas for advancing equity in transportation electrification. Thanks, Neda.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's nice to see a lot of familiar names. You might have been interacting with me a bit over the past couple of months in planning this boot camp, and I appreciate all of you participating and contributing to this. So as Sue mentioned, my name is Neda Deylami. I'm the campaigns organizer for the EC. I work in the Midwest states of Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, as well as Nevada. I'm an attorney based in Chicago, where all that dirty air is going to Eastern Wisconsin. Sorry about that. It's not me though, I drive electric.
Listen, it's not your fault.
Prior to the EC and in my Chicago work, I co-founded a EV owners group called Chicago for EVs that worked to advance policy to expand access to EVs, specifically for low-income Black and Brown communities, renters, and people living in urban areas. So basically me. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about what equity means and what that looks like in EV policy. As we mentioned, this presentation was made with support from the Greenlining Institute. The Greenlining Institute is a nonprofit organization that works to advance economic opportunity and empowerment for people of color. They work in advocacy that addresses the root causes of racial, economic, and environmental inequities. So we can go to the first slide, and I want to start out with talking about the conversation of current inequities, needing to look at the historical inequities to see how they've influenced the communities that we have today. Kind of as a case study, I'm using the city of Milwaukee to demonstrate that. So on the left here, we have a 1939 map of the redlining that occurred in Milwaukee, where the federal government, in an effort to assess the riskiness of mortgage loans, stepped in to rate neighborhoods based on factors that were primarily based off of race of the inhabitants. So this was explicitly made from the federal government to try to segregate communities based off of that, meaning that whiter neighborhoods were better for investment. If you want to know more about this topic, I highly recommend Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. But just to give some background in the glossary of this, the red areas, I'll start with green. The green areas were deemed to be great areas, the best areas to invest in. And the assessors literally mentioned the fact that because they were exclusively white areas, these were the best areas to invest in. One assessor likened it to the wide latitude of discrimination in accepting residents, also known as the restrictive covenants, where deeds in these areas and the properties in these areas specifically restricted the sale or conveyance of property to anyone who was not of the white race. And blue was along those lines, also as desirable. Once we get into the yellow and red categories, these were deemed as declining areas. Yellow are areas that are now majority Black in Milwaukee, and red was straight up deemed hazardous for investment. This is a quote: "This is the Negro and slum area of Milwaukee. Besides colored people, a large number of lower type Jews are moving into this section." We can see on the right side that this has manifested in a very stark segregation by race of areas of Milwaukee, the racial segregation that we see today that has multiple effects. For those effects, the next slide. We are seeing the redlining map juxtaposed with the Centers for Disease Control's Social Vulnerability Index. The social vulnerability refers to the potential negative effects on communities caused by external stresses on human health. Those can be man-made or natural disasters. Reducing this vulnerability can decrease both human suffering and economic loss. What that suffering looks like is shown in the next slide, where I have the environmental justice screen tool from the EPA showing the map of ozone and particulate matter burden by neighborhood of Milwaukee, which we just learned about from Dr. Scholz's wonderful presentation about the effects that can have on public health. And then on the right, we have COVID-19 hospitalization data showing the rate of hospitalization being higher in those areas. So these were areas that in the interwar period were specifically discriminated against, engineered to have a lack of investment, and now are suffering the most from bad air pollution and bad health outcomes from things like COVID. As we learned, emissions from oil-powered vehicles contribute the most to smog and ozone and that particulate matter pollution. How this fits into transportation, to give the example of Milwaukee's Interstate 43, which runs north through south through North Milwaukee. So we're still on the previous slide. The I-43 running through the north side of Milwaukee had to destroy about 17,000 homes, 1,000 businesses through a very wealthy middle-class Black neighborhood, isolating parts of the community from each other and thus exacerbating the disinvestment that we see today. Now those areas also have the worst air pollution burden, as we learned, because of their proximity to highways. At the same time, we want to keep in mind that lower income households spend more of their income on transportation than their wealthier counterparts. So both for health reasons and for personal affordability, there's a lot of benefits that we can see for the most underserved areas in electrifying transportation. And I can go to the next one. So what equity is specifically is transforming the behaviors, institutions, and systems that disproportionately harm people of color. We're increasing access to power to those who don't have it, redistributing and providing additional resources where needed, and eliminating barriers. And this graphic is a good example of how one size does not fit all in access and power. We want to provide for communities where they need it for them to reach their full potential. Next. How to guide your equity standards in your work. So we don't want to be race blind because we have seen the specific racial inequities, explicit discrimination that we've seen exacerbated now into the present, into the future. We want to be conscious of that. And we also want to prioritize multi-sector approaches. This means not just personal vehicles, but public transportation, buses, trucks, as well as all other kinds of electric mobility like e-bikes. We want these benefits to be intentional. We want the community to build capacity to actually engage in these processes, and we want the processes to be community driven. And because those communities have been left out of wealth building from the past because of those discrimination, those inequities, we want to make sure that the path does build towards wealth building. This comes up in every process of the stage, goals, process, and implementation, and then measuring your success as well. Next slide. So what this looks like specifically in EV policy, we want EV adoption goals, but we want them to be considerate of low-income programs that can benefit the people who need it the most. Rebates are great, but we also want to keep in mind those burdened of transportation expenses to have a little bit more help to replace, scrap and replace the most expensive and dirtiest cars that they've had to hold on to. Infrastructure is a big one. So if you currently build infrastructure based off of where there is demand, you're going to be ending up serving the early adopters that tend to be wealthier, whiter, and suburban. We want to intentionally deliver benefits to areas that need it by building infrastructure where it is the most needed. EV awareness, I'm sure all of you know, education and awareness is a huge barrier to mass EV adoption, but we also want to make sure that our EV awareness and education is culturally relevant, that people are seeing EV drivers and owners that look like themselves, that have similar lifestyles, and understand where they're coming from. I think this might be the last slide. So these have just been some examples of how to implement equity into our work. As policymakers, we all want to craft policies that make the world a better place. But the first step is recognizing that one size does not fit all. So with that, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening.